Okay, now we will have our roundtable discussion. Please, Maarit, Forde, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jukka, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. Welcome everyone to the final session of today. We've had a day full of thought-provoking discussions, and now we have the chance to engage in a conversation around ethnography near and far, shaking the Malinowskian ideal. And I'll introduce the speakers and speak very briefly about the sort of premises of the conversation, after which we'll have our talk. And then I'll leave time for your contributions and questions and comments towards the end. So we are very pleased to have Anca, Enache, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Helsinki. She's published widely on questions around Roma people, migration, inequality, activism, and transnational childhood. Anca has conducted multi-sited fieldwork in Romania and Finland, and written about ethnographic methods, especially in regard to working with children, for example, using drawing as a method, which I find interesting. And she's also looked at mobile and translocal communities and methods specific to those. And Tuomas Järvenpää is a postdoctoral researcher and at the University of Eastern Finland. And he specializes in the intersections of music and religion in Africa and African diaspora. He's explored, for example, evangelical hip-hop in Namibia, and in another project, reggae and Rastafarianism in Finland and South Africa. Like Anca, Tuomas's ethnography relies on multi-sited fieldwork. And feel free to correct me and add things to my introductions. And Marko Juntunen is an anthropologist and docent of is it Middle Eastern and Islamic cultures?
Middle Eastern and Islamic studies.
Studies, right. His ethnographic projects in Morocco and Finland have addressed questions around masculinity, migration, Muslim public spaces, often in transnational or multicultural contexts. Marko has written a substantial body of scholarly articles and books, and including the award-winning Matkalla islamilaisessa Suomessa, which got the Tiedon julkistamisen valtion palkinto last year. Yeah. And in that project, he investigates sort of everyday Islam and diversity in a suburb called Varissuo in this town in Turku. And Shelene has been introduced once already, but since some of you weren't here this morning, Shelene Gomes teaches anthropology at the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago at the St. Augustine campus. And she's also taught anthropology in Ethiopia. Her work on the Jamaican Rastafari in Ethiopia has advanced our understanding of migration, belonging, and cosmology from an important South-South perspective. And she's currently working with returned migrant women and care work in Trinidad. And my name is Maarit, Forde. I teach anthropology in Helsinki. So, like Matti, I reread my Malinowski in preparation to the discussion, and in his introduction to Argonauts, he outlines the rules and principles and strategies, something he calls the ethnographer's magic, which aims at, and I quote, understanding other men's point of view. What is then, he writes, this ethnographer's magic, by which he's able to evoke the real spirit of the natives, the true picture of tribal life? The principles of method can be grouped under three main headings. First of all, naturally, says Malinowski, the student must possess real scientific aims and know the values and criteria of modern ethnography. Secondly, he ought to put himself in good conditions of work, that is, in the main, to live without other white men, right among the natives. Finally, he has to apply a number of special methods of collecting, manipulating, and fixing his evidence. And then he goes on to elaborate what these mechanisms are, sort of strategies are. As we all know, the principles and strategies have come under much scrutiny and criticism since, and ethnography has been reimagined and reworked in many ways over the past decades, not least by feminist and post-colonial scholars. So we've begun to think about our fields within changing historical and political economic circumstances, something that Malinowski's contemporary, Zora Neale Hurston, might have taught us already in the 1920s when she conducted fieldwork in Florida and asked questions about migration and labor and the environment and legacies of slavery. Had Zora Neale Hurston been given an equally prominent place in the discipline of anthropology and the origin myths of ethnography, our workshop today would seem quite different. Another advance or sort of step forward that we've taken is the recognition of diversity in the communities we work with and the need to be reflective about our positions, our roles as embodied, interacting, affected, and affecting knowledge producers. And finally, the ethnographic method as prescribed by Malinowski has been widened to embrace multimodal methods, activist research, co-research with our interlocutors, and so forth. In fact, there's a recent project with Trobrianders as co-researchers, looking into the spirits of the dead and their roots of reincarnation, and they sort of argue against Malinowski's interpretations in Paloma. It's a very recent sort of a effort to talk back or speak back. So with these sorts of reworkings of the method, we've certainly moved a long way toward more just and more transparent and collaborative ethnography. And yet many of us are paying heed and indeed contributing to powerful critiques of the persevering coloniality of anthropology and ethnography as an extractivist method or a method that sustains white supremacy or Eurocentric epistemology. I'm inspired by critics such as Faye Harrison, who was mentioned here earlier, who have managed to disturb the premises of ethnography without abandoning the ultimate aim of the ethnographer's magic, understanding what the world can look like from somebody else's perspective. And I'll just read a very brief quote from Harrison before I ask our roundtable discussions to begin. So Harrison writes, if you're someplace in the midst of things long enough, these things will come to you. You have the opportunity to ferret out information from lots of different locations, intersections, channels, some of which you hadn't even thought of before when you designed your research proposal and got your funding. There's room for improvisation. There's room for the sort of dialogues and relationships that allow us to collaborate in a multiplicity of forms. We can speak in voices, if we wish to, that resonate with and are more similar to the voices of the people who answer our questions, as opposed to speaking in a voice that is so alien to them. I think all those possibilities are there in the types of ethically and socially responsible ethnographic praxis that I have observed that people I really admire are doing over time. And I'd like to hear your ideas about this ethnographic praxis, our craft. And I've asked you to think about what you find sort of particularly valuable in contemporary critiques of ethnography and in the suggestions for reimagining and reworking our methods. What are the things that you especially sort of cherish or have benefited from in your own work? Should we start with Anca? Yeah.
Yep. Yes, thank you. So I try to be very short, but I anyway have to start a little bit from how I entered into my field work. It was in about 2010 when I moved to Finland from Romania, and I was doing studies, not anthropological studies then, and acting as an au pair. And at the same time, in the Finnish society, there was lots of societal debate or media debate, political debate about the presence of Romanian Roma people who were begging. Like, of course, there were these very heterogeneous ideas that there is a group of people begging on the streets of Helsinki, and of course, all these images were very, heterogeneous and labeling and stereotyping. But anyway, I was in Finland, like recently moved, and suddenly there was all these things going around, and all kind of information vehiculating, and like very intense media spread of information and so on. And back then I couldn't even follow probably the media so well, except the visionary image, which was also, of course, very representative and very labeling and interesting. But anyway, some people told me that, there is like translated what is the discussion about, and that I should try to engage with these discussions. Like with the organization, Diakonis Foundation back then, that started to do something on this issue, basically to similarly with what we also do sometimes in research, to collect data in a different way about these people and to inform the public, like this kind of need of knowing the other, who are they, why are they coming, and of course lots of labeling and othering information. But anyway, and then of course there was also a lot about, Roma, but even more because of course these representations were not very sophisticated, about Romania. What is Romania? So in all this discussion, there were ideas about Romania from the East and how Romania shouldn't be accepted to the European Union and then not to the Schengen. So suddenly this very kind of concrete and kind of community and presence, visible presence in the urban settings in Helsinki raised many discussions and also revealed many ideas about basically about East, about Romania in this Nordic and Finnish context. Basically I assisted to these things and then engaged with them through this outreach work done by this NGO that of course I was very critical also about, and I'm still working with the same organization, also the NGO level, but in different area, basically supporting and facilitating, acting as a tool for Roma organizations around Europe to have possibilities to do their own projects and their own work at the moment. But anyway, related to multi-sited ethnography, first when I started to work on my PhD, and basically I was doing field work with another Finnish anthropologist, Airi Markkanen, there was this idea that we need to go to Romania. From where they are coming, we need to go there. And of course, I was a good, I fitted in that ideal of being, because many of the people that were present in Helsinki were coming from East Romania, from some localities where I also grown up. So we went to Romania and we did field work in there. And then for me, like to talk also about the shifts, my own kind of shifts and changes and movements about multi-sided thinking and doing ethnography. Then it became more that actually in Helsinki, like looking back to Helsinki, to what's happening in there, it is what became more relevant. So this kind of whatever back home became Helsinki, or the field became Helsinki, of course also looking into relation to Romania, but then also like new sites emerged. Like I noticed that people have connections obviously to many other places, to other Nordic settings. So somehow I became how ethnography, multi-sited ethnography, but not only in the sense of physical and geography became very relevant for me, is because it became obvious that the everyday aggressions in very localized spaces, like how contemporary inequalities and disciplining practices and control in Nordic settings, it's very much about this everyday routines, about norms, how space should be used and how it's organized. So in the end, from this very multi-sided and different countries, and of course there are the politics and issues at that level, I became very interested, and I in the end worked a lot with how space it's controlled and organized in Helsinki, of course in relation to the presence of Roma who are earning or spending many private life events on the street because of displacement. So definitely I found it that ethnographic and like basically doing things together and following things and changes also in the city, of course, like conversing and spending time with the interlocutors, but also like observing the infrastructural changes in Helsinki, and also different actors' movements became extremely important and useful. And I think it tells something about contemporary inequalities. Yeah. If I can, of course, just tell something about like the discipline, or I can continue. Of course, like when working on inequalities and Roma issues like anthropology and ethnography, and in general Romanist studies have a very specific position. So of course, anthropological Romanist studies focus a lot on issues of culture and language, monographies, and they have created a lot the idea of other. And now there is more understanding and discussion how Roma have been the other of Europe, and how ideas of nations and Europe, what means Europeanness, has been produced and reproduced in relation to different Roma communities in different contexts, and basically also Roma as a construction in Europe. And of course, in the context of migration, what I noticed then during my field, it was that the recreation of this European other through Roma migrants from Eastern Europe in different settings, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we are coming close to Patricia's themes about the other. Would you like to?
Yeah, I can continue from here. I think what emerges from what you say is also that what is field work and what is field, because I think that it's, for me at least, less place where you go and more of this kind of encounter between you, the research, and then the research participants. So I have conceived what constitutes as field work. And then when I also think about ethnography, perhaps it's also a long-term, somehow committed encounter, somehow ethical, or I love what Shelene said about cultivating empathy. That's really the essence of ethnography for me. But when you ask about this, what I find valuable in this critique for ethnography is that now I teach a couple of years these master's seminars in our cultural studies department, which has basically very interdisciplinary seminars. So there's students from different majors with ethnomusicology, cultural anthropology, media studies, gender studies, art sociology, folklore studies. So that's the seminars that we have. And in these few years when I was teaching there, I don't remember that there was any who would have done ethnographic work, and also very few who would do any kind of field work. So to have any kind of human contact with the research participant. The students really chose more to do textual or visual or audio analysis without this kind of human encounter, which I find is a pity. And I think that when I, for example, read this manifesto for patchwork ethnography, what I found really valuable in it was that it somehow a little bit lowers the bar, that ethnography doesn't have to be so intimidating, that it's something that I wish more students would do, at least in some form, to have this kind of human encounter and open up to this. I think Patricia said about wonder and surprise, that what happens when you actually meet live person. Okay, perhaps I give it to you.
Yeah, I would, if I throw in some more ideas in the beginning, is that it's really valuable to read Malinowskian texts and texts of the time in general to understand what is missing there and the whole complexities of contemporary world. Just to think about the context, there was a global crisis which actually forced Malinowski to actually do a very long duration field work. And I have kept this in mind, that what is the sort of broader global context where I am engaging in ethnography. I started my PhD work in a context where European border policy was radically changing with regard to North African and Mediterranean migrations. And this idea was in my mind all the time. I am studying people, their ways of world making in a very radically different global context. And then when I understood that I'm actually meeting these Moroccan young men, urban poverty setting, and what I'm hearing is response to this very, very massive scale global change. And then from Morocco, I moved to study post-conflict Iraq, post-occupation Iraq. And it was like Malinowski in the First World War, but he never wrote it in the text in any form. And it's always, you have to keep in mind the complexity, that really broad picture that surrounds your ethnographic field. And then fundamentally, I'm totally in similar, project. It's the ethnographic magic is to understand the ways of world making in certain contexts. But you have to, just really kind of carve out where are the relevant voices that allow you to understand the world. So for me, it's not only the people, it's the social media, it's their Facebook commenting, but more than anything nowadays, it's also the local news stations, the ways they cover the conflict or certain issue. And also, unlike Malinowski, we have also, we have popular culture that comes from these settings, that comments on the reality. So it's much more sort of versatile and much more complex set of voices that we have to understand. And so I'll leave it here at the moment.
Thanks for bringing up the complexity of the field from various perspectives.
Okay, so I think two things come to mind. So one I probably would have mentioned previously, but the idea that anthropology has so much of value, and ethnography as a way of knowing, as a set of methods and techniques, and as a mindset as well, has so much of value outside of those who are studying related disciplines, right? Or anthropology in particular. And so one of the things that I've tried to do quite recently, because my ethnographic fieldwork was quite conventional in the sense that I went there, I stayed, and I talked to people, But one of the things that I've tried to do quite recently is develop a blog that helps my students. So it's doing ethnography at STA. Again, like much of the work that academics do, it's unwaged, it's voluntary. And so I have a couple of postgraduate students who can pitch in sometimes, again, on a voluntary basis. And so the blog actually takes excerpts from undergraduate student ethnographic projects that they do over a semester. And we're still focused a great deal on writing. So there isn't that much of the visual and the other kinds of media that I would like to incorporate and that students have asked for. But it's the first thing is that undertaking the ethnographic project, these are students who are not doing majors in anthropology, who have never, or not never, but many students are not very familiar with anthropology, with ethnology, with ethnography, and are doing majors in lots of other disciplines in the humanities. And so one of the things doing an ethnographic study, a short-term, semester-long ethnographic study helps them to do is precisely that, is to understand that there are many different ways of knowing and interpreting, but also the power dynamics that go into the normative categories and classifications that affect everyone's life to different degrees. And so with the students, I choose a few hundred words and then do some editing and we post it. And so I think one of the things it does is helps young people. This might actually be related to a second point that we may discuss, but it helps youth and it helps younger people younger students as well, or more mature students in the case of my university, to think about the value of this kind of ethnographic mindset and the value of anthropology. And then the second thing is that it opens it up to a wider audience outside of the university. And so it's akin to a public anthropology, but more so also an applied anthropology, because this is the second thing that I wanted to mention. So I think from my particular vantage, the university, certainly in the English-speaking Caribbean, from about the 1950s to the 1970s, before structural adjustment programs were introduced, was a site of radicalism, of radical thought, of action, of activism. And so going to the university meant that you were challenging the kinds of normative ideas and structures that had been put in place and that have since been put in place in different ways with new hierarchies. But going to the university was, for many, not all, but a sort of a radical act in itself. And so anthropology, for me, has always had that sort of applied dimension to it. And so as a colleague has mentioned, the kind of way that there hasn't been this distinction between the high theory and the applied anthropologist, even though in fact in much of North America, that distinction applies a great deal, where I was partly trained. But doing anthropology and then doing ethnography in various fields was a lifelong commitment, right, as a colleague mentioned. And so those are the two things that I immediately think about, even with my experience of doing more conventional ethnography.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you want to pick up on that, or because I have a kind of a follow-up question to Shelene on. Since you mentioned working with students and writing blogs with them, and Tuomas, you spoke about your students' sort of reluctance or hesitancy in working with people doing ethnography. Shelene, you are working at a university where anthropology is very much a sort of in a marginalized position, and sometimes in a defensive position where you have to explain what ethnography means and what its value is. Could you talk a little bit about how to do this with students? How do you make them see the magic or the value in the craft? And I'm inviting all of you to share your thoughts on this as well. But if we start with Shelene.
Thank you. So some of my anthropology colleagues at universities in the North, and particularly in the US, and I have a very passionate discussion, shall we say, about the way that I'm doing this at the university, because I think as Patricia mentioned, I have kind of pitched anthropology to students, because luckily there is one anthropology course that is mandatory for students taking disciplines, taking majors, in sociology and in criminology. And in much of the social sciences and the humanities, there are declining student numbers at my university. And so, of course, all of the things that we've mentioned before, the kind of way that that neoliberal grammar is quantitative, right? Those are all of the sorts of things that are privileged. And there's a heavy focus on the criminological aspects of sociology. And I teach in the sociology program. I teach anthropology courses within the sociology program. And so criminology, is very well subscribed as compared to sociology courses, which are not as well subscribed. And so the way that I've sort of pitched anthropology to students is to frame it in terms of solving social problems. And so I think one of our colleagues mentioned this. And so my colleagues in mostly in the US, in US academia, are very, these are simply my colleagues, this isn't everyone, of course, but they're vehemently opposed to this. Because they understand the use of applied anthropology within the universities that they are privileged enough to be at. It is not couched as a social problem. So it is still understanding the heterogeneity of cultures, understanding from emic perspectives, understanding that the value of cultivating empathy and sympathy, but not to solve social problems. So I think I've taken more of the applied route to pitch anthropology. And so what I ask students to do in this particular course, because we have 3 anthropology courses, so I have a different pitch for each course. And so the course where in Caribbean anthropology, where they do the semester-long projects, I say to them, think about something that affects you and that affects the society and that affects many people who may not be here. What's that? What is that problem that you would like to learn more about or reflect on and then solve? And so that's the kind of the technique that I use now.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. How does that sound?
Well, I say something very short. For me, it's really fascinating that through field work, I may sound quite Geertzian, but you get this access to experience near concepts. And the fascination with these experience near concepts is that it really makes you feel that the way the large media, public or political discourse or many other disciplines, the way in which they use the concepts, they're not actually in harmony with the ways people use the concept. Just to give you an example, it was fascinating for me to study what we call migrant smuggling in the north of Morocco, because people don't talk about migrant smuggling. They talk about very embodied concept, harraga, which means about piercing, running through a red light. But it's also about the grievances that I need to do something with my life. And the men that I studied, they had the harq, which is related to concept harraga. They had the burning in their chest. So for me, like wanting to really to do something which was nearly impossible. So for me, the fascination of anthropology is here. And I think for me, it's also a vehicle to question these large scale concepts that the political scientists use, that Turkey wants to do this, but Israel wants to do that. for me, it's like, no, it's much more complex. And the challenge is to make my message as an ethnographer relevant, because they're so, I mean, who cares about how they feel in their chest when Europe needs to, do something about migration? But it's my job as an ethnographer to tell them, no, it's very relevant to see how people experience the situation and take it into account when you're, making large scale policies or political reactions. And it's not for all. Not all of our students are fascinated to go into grassroots level. So for me, it's very natural. It doesn't resonate with everyone. But it's so great to see that some students are like, wow, there's this really minute, this very like everyday level of knowledge that can also be scientifically explored.
Very well put. I think for me, the value of ethnography, or the magic of ethnography, was what you might have just said about Malinowski, that he said that understanding the other's point of view. I think in ethnography, you have to open up to the unexpected in a way that you perhaps do not do in other methods. If I look at from my perspective as a music researcher, we often have this kind of tendency as music researchers to study the music genres that we like. I can confess that I started out as a reggae listener, and then I wanted to study the genre. And we perhaps have our own ideas then that what is good reggae music, some kind of normative assumptions. And I think when you do ethnography of a music genre, then you have to call these into question and open up to the unexpected, that what challenge these assumptions that we have. Kind of like often when we do, for example, just musical analysis, it's very easy to project these kind of normative assumptions, like overestimate our insider knowledge, that I put on my own interpretation of what is good reggae into this analysis that I do. But in ethnography, I think that's the point, that you open up to the unexpected new points of view. That's why I like it, and I would justify it by that.
Yeah, maybe just to add, like if you think about the kind of the difference or like between kind of interviews and conversation, if I'm thinking about my field work, like having an interview and especially like people who have been questioned all the time and through specific kind of vocabulary, of course you could kind of adapt your questions so that they are more appropriate. But so precisely like ethnographic fieldwork, being there, having conversations, and like the interaction, and then also the reciprocity, and this kind of emerging, these relations that emerge through the field work, and you realize that there is specific kind of interaction or reciprocity, because you are at the specific moment kind of located in a specific regime, and also the other persons are. And then of course also the changes when things are changing, and in relation to that, this long-term commitment or this long-term work, that you can see changes and you can see different contexts. Like of course for me, seeing people, my interlocutors in a Romanian context, and then in the Finnish context, where we are like each of us are located in a different way. Like so I think this is amazing, and of course it cannot be grasped through kind of sociological interviews or like meeting the person and having an interview and that's it about. And then these issues about reciprocity, and somehow of course like exposing yourself also, and thinking about own of course positionality, but also vulnerabilities and power relations and all that, and maybe something more about that, like in relation to reciprocity, not only this idea of giving back or making together, kind of thinking about how to influence and to contribute to some issues that are meaningful for people. I think it was very interesting what you said, that yeah, this issue that of course, and how ethnography, of course, through ethnography we get these unique ideas about life words and what how to live life and so on, but then how to make them relevant, like for the wide public, that yeah, it is significant how different people experience different issues. But I was also thinking about this idea of difference also in relation to sameness, kind of, in this reciprocity, that there are also there are kind of when you are in a specific context and in different locations, you of course experience things in a different way, but also there are similarities between the ethnographer and the people in the field, kind of.
And how do you think, Anca and others, how do those encounters and those reciprocities and these sort of interactions and affect, how do they train us or help us think about our craft as ethnographers? Can you think of events or encounters in the field, for example, that have really sort of made you rethink or take a step back or grow as ethnographers?
Well, I have had not the pleasure, but I have had the journey to work with people who have suffered tremendously in conflicts. And often friends ask that, how can you manage, for example, you know, you can imagine what the last 3 generations of Iraqis have experienced. That isn't it such a dark world to enter in, and how do you handle it? And it's very maybe difficult for non-anthropologists to understand how empowering it is to see how people deal with the past traumas and they overcome them, and what kind of resources they have and how they build their lives despite tremendous sufferings, and how actually presence of an anthropologist can be also it can be a very therapeutic situation, but you have to be very careful in the ways in which you kind of craft your own role with the encounters. I think it's very empowering to be close to people who are reworking and working with their trauma. It's not only a very burdensome experience.
Well, I've been thinking this limits of ethnography or this kind of collaborative research, because often when I now do research on evangelical Christian music, I often get asked that, is there a danger that I become a mouthpiece for these musicians, or in general for the Christian right somehow? And that's a really little bit unresolved question for me, that how deep collaboration I really can have, and what are the limits. And I can also confess that in the latest research publication that I had, I kind of moved away from the ethnographic paradigm in a way that I did a musical analysis where I did not include the view of these musicians. But now thinking back to it, I think that it would have been a much better article if there would have been both my analysis and also their voice. But there's this kind of, I think, also a tense relationship between me and the field. But this is also maybe something that's a more broader problematic or tension in anthropological work in general.
I think so too, and not least in activist anthropology, where you have to balance your role as a researcher and activist and a mouthpiece. Yeah. Shelene and Anca, do you want to?
Yeah, I was also thinking that it's very, very complex, and also like Marko was telling about the empowering. Of course, like I think everyday encounters, of course, you see exactly the how people resist and navigate and power and so on. But for me, somehow it didn't work. It doesn't work in that way that much, because at the same time yeah, of course I'm thinking yeah, somehow it doesn't work, but maybe it's more about also a lot about responsibility and how it my own responsibility and exactly what I'm able to produce and to somehow to be in line with their also projects, with people's projects, but then also like I'm sorry, yeah, I think also about, of course, the collaborative writings. I've been also like now recently, I mean, these encounters, of course, the topics, basically, it kind of influenced, I think I have had, and I wanted to say that, of course, it changes across different times, like in which stage you are like a researcher, and it kind of changes. But of course, like one thing has been to try to focus on themes and topics that seem very relevant for the people, for my more like permanent interlocutors. So because of course, if in a specific, like in Romani studies, there used to be a focus on language and such issues, and it became obvious during the field encounters that in fact, even like that I would speak Romani language as a non-Roma, it's not something that is desired. So then, of course, I very much actually I try to place myself out of such conversation and to give space and to kind of allow people to communicate what they communicate, of course, with me. But also like about collaborative writing, I also think that it's very complicated in that sense that, of course, what are the ambitions of the discipline, and then our ambitions as writers and researcher, and then what are the everyday lives and projects of the people, and how to bring these two worlds together, and then of course how to do it as a format, and how to, of course, like what was discussed earlier here, like the publishing requirements and all these issues. But actually from Roma, from so-called Roma literature, there's a good example, like there's a book called Writing Friendship by Paloma Gai Blasco. And basically what she did is that with one of her initial interlocutors, she did field work all in all after her PhD for 20 years in relation to same people and same settings. So basically she wrote a book in which her key interlocutor is talking about same topics, and she's talking. So it's like a dialogue book, and they are co-authoring this book. So this is a very, and she's of course critical about the possibilities and about the challenges also of this kind of writing, and in the end what has been cut and how it has been written, and this kind of questions.
Do you want to continue on that? Or?
Oh, if I might also add one thing that I just thought of, yes, because one of the things also I appreciate about Writing Friendship, about Paloma's and Liria's book,
Yes,
because yes, it's written with Paloma and Liria, and they have developed a friendship, right, across ethnicity, across class, across geography. I mean, they've also spent, Liria has spent a good deal of time in Paloma's home in St. Andrews in Scotland, and so I have thought a good deal about, it's not so much encounters in the field, but thought and haven't yet really done anything about it, but in doing more collaborative ethnography. Mm-hmm. And because, for instance, and I know many anthropologists will be familiar with this kind of conundrum, it doesn't help necessarily some interlocutors to have their name on a book. And for some, it does help, of course. And for some, it helps to have a public persona and to have a public profile. And so one of the things that Writing Friendship and connecting my thinking about doing more collaborative ethnography is also acknowledging and recognizing that ethnography is always collaborative, and writing and doing research. But again, the problematic of who gets the credit is still there. And so just to add also, I had maybe not recently anymore, maybe a year ago, written a blog post with a postgraduate student in gender and development studies with an undocumented migrant, quote unquote, worker from Venezuela. And we asked, are you okay with including your name as an author? Because in a situation like this, having a public profile might help his claim for refugee status, or he may be less likely to be deported. And this is where I think also the mainstream media as well as social media can be useful at times. And he decided against it because he was too fearful that being publicly known would result in deportation, right, or in imprisonment. And so to kind of just to think about collaborative ethnography, how all research is always collaborative, but again, the politics of authorship, and to point as well to Paloma and Neria's book as a way of working through that in practice. To add, yes, thanks.
Do you want to comment on that? Collaborations or other kinds of methods?
Well, I tend to think nowadays that there are so many more levels to doing anthropology than just producing together. It's just, we were talking about this long-term commitment, and let the long-term commitment take its own course. You know, you through communicating over a long period of time, let it evolve to the direction it wants to go. I mean, I have written together with some of my people who started as a sort of anthropological informants, and now they developed into different kinds of friendships, and I don't really worry about what to do with them as long as we feel like it's the cooperation is very natural. I have traveled to Middle East with my Iraqi friends. We have had holidays together, and I don't really, you know, very often even think about it, what to do with it. As long as I perceive also doing ethnography nowadays in a much more broader way than when I started as a PhD student. And I'm not even very much conscious about it. Is this ethnography anymore? And for me, it's very relieving that you can create little by little your own anthropology. And I stepped out of academic circles, and I don't feel like I stopped being an anthropologist. And I haven't written any academic papers for 2 years, but I still consider myself first and foremost ethnographer. And it's a very, very sort of relieving experience. And you don't have to leave it, even if you leave the academia.
You work with people who make music, and Anca, you've used, for example, drawing as a way to produce or co-produce knowledge. Do you find that these sorts of ethnographic methods help you approach questions differently or ask questions you wouldn't ask otherwise? How do the arts
what comes first is that, like, I think from the discussion that is kind of, we of course look for kind of one model, and or somehow there is this urge, and of course there is not one model, what Marko was telling, and of course I think it's very good, the point that what kind of issues emerge and happen, like, but of course we need we sometimes have some methods or tools that support us, but this kind of reciprocal relations and methods, and that were discussed also in regards to Paloma and Lydia's book, they just emerge and you kind of see, but like in regards to I used like drawing, and also in general photography a bit. Like in regards to drawings, more the idea was of course that we did a study with children whose parents were commuting between Romania and Finland, and that was more like, of course, kind of method that seemed to be a good way to discuss about things and represent issues, though of course this is also something that you can be critical towards, like drawing and children all the time, kind of. But then in regards to photography, and visual anthropology, I haven't gone very in depth with that, but I use that a lot when doing my urban ethnography, in the sense of photographing spaces, and in a way as a way to document the changes that are happening in the urban space, but then also my interlocutors ask that they want to document some specific issues or incidents. Yeah, and as a way also to discuss about those urban settings, which were the contexts where specific issues and acts against them or with them happened. So yeah, I think it's a good way to kind of course also document and follow the changes. For me, that was also because it seemed that there are happening many changes in the urban space that I couldn't analyze kind of right away. But then when looking at the same space that changed, like infrastructure, of course, these changes in the public space, that benches would be cut or spaces where they used to stay would be blocked. And this way also understanding the bigger picture, like how that all specific spaces are governed and who governs them, and how many multiple actors are also basically involved in controlling and organizing these spaces.
First thing that comes to my mind about specifically researching about musicians is that sometimes quite hard to get an audience with them or to meet them, because there are some kind of public figures or celebrities and they have a limited time, a lot of people trying to get access to them. But what I found that what's very useful is that I have had this kind of relationships, or I have done interviews with some musicians only once. But I think it's very valuable if I can develop that kind of relationship where we can meet several times, that we get this kind of feedback loop, that I can somehow check my interpretations, that go back into these issues and check that have I understood correctly. And I think in the best relationships, so it's also so that they perhaps play some of their music to me and ask, how do you like this? So it's this kind of mutual feedback. And I think that's when I would start to call it ethnography. And otherwise it's just a interview research, which is okay as well. But that's what I try to get is this kind of feedback loop.
Yeah. I have one more question to you before I open to the floor, unless you have other questions in mind you'd like to explore. And as we've heard, you've all worked in various field sites over your careers. You've changed over your life course as researchers, and your circumstances have changed, your field location has changed, and the encounters with the people, the relationships have evolved. How has this affected your sort of research positions or positionalities, your need for self-reflection, for example, this sort of evolving, your evolving place as ethnographers?
Well, I am laughing because what I'm about to say sounds so, it sounds so stupid, simply. I have started to more and more appreciate doing rather than producing. I really enjoy just having a project and doing the project, not doing the final product. I hate it. I hate the writing part, but I really like doing field work. And I don't know what happens when when I pass away finally with all these tapings and notes, and which I know that I will never do anything with them. And it's just, I like it. I really like the challenge of finding people, getting to know them, sit and spend time. It's a very rich experience. And to finally to feel that, well, do what you like to do if you have the chance to do it. And I don't think that I will regret that I did not publish 80 articles more.
That's great self-reflection. I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also love to do over and over again this master's thesis and the fieldwork for the master's thesis. That's the best. But about self-reflection, what I've started to think about lately a little bit more is this kind of what I also already referred to was this secularist bias that we have in university or in academia, that there's Patricia was talking about this unknown and the other, and I think evangelical Christianity really is easily this kind of unknown and the other, in terms that we are the secular researchers and they are the other who are the religious ones. But somehow engaging with this kind of bias and then finding out how valuable it could be somehow to unpack this and see what kind of what's the lived reality in this kind of conservative Christian communities, that there's many kinds of peoples and many kinds of lived worlds inside there, that how to get past this otherness, and that's, I think it would be the value of ethnographic research. That's also what I dreamed that I could continue, because I've done this field now for, this is the third year, and I think that I'm only scratching the surface. So I would dream that I could continue it also, because only now I'm somehow realizing this kind of stereotypes and preconditions that I had about the subject matter a little bit more.
Yeah, I really also liked what Marko said, and I also think that I really enjoy doing field work and conversing in the sense also of learning, of course, new thing, and having like interaction with different contexts and different life worlds and so on. So it's yeah, it's very beautiful. In regards to also positionality, I think for my own case, of course, this issue of race or being a Roma and not being a Roma, and how this works in different contexts is extremely important. And of course, I'm trying to be extremely reflective, because the most important thing is in any way to be sensitive and to learn what it means for my interlocutors that I'm a Romanian. So we have had this case in Finland that we are Romanian migrants, but still, of course, in the Romanian context and European context, from that point of view, being Roma and non-Roma. And this is a huge discussion in our field. And then, of course, for me, it's a continuous learning how these classifications and issues work in practice, and what kind of meanings people give to them and how they locate me, and then how should I adapt and behave in relation to that. So this is for me the most, and of course the whole idea in discussion that there should be more knowledge produced by Roma scholars, and there is change also in this direction, but there is very little, and in general histories and national histories have been written so that Roma are at the margins, and of course everything that has been written has been by non-Roma scholars, but now activists are also doing work in that direction.
And I think those sort of accumulating experiences of having yourself sort of being seen by others and being assessed and mirrored in terms of making sense of who they are by looking at you, or making sense of who they are not by looking at you, is something that benefits us as researchers, but also perhaps helps us grow as human beings in general, as in any relationship. So I think it's, I really appreciate that you brought that in. Shelene, you've also worked in various fields in different parts of the world. Would you like to tell us more about that?
I think you've captured what I was thinking of, because I was thinking more along the hyphenated insider-outsider categorization that I still think is useful. I think a lot of these concepts are still useful, right? The emic, the insider-outsider, the halfie, but I like the doing of the ethnography and I like the writing of it as well. But one of the things that I reflected on is pretty much what you also said, Maarit, and what colleagues have said is that I have been positioned. I'm framed, right? I'm coded differently wherever I study, I work, I live. Whether it's Egypt or Ethiopia or Mexico or Trinidad and Tobago or Barbados or Guyana, but in the case of Shashamane, there's a particular the insider outsiders. I may be from the Caribbean, but I have a class privilege that many repatriates do not have, and some do have. And I think one of the things that ethnography, that first fieldwork, and that first time that I spent there helped me to appreciate is that simple privilege that some people don't recognize, that some people have to hustle every day to make sure that they eat, right? And that I may have been aware of very abstractly, but I hadn't experienced. And certainly as a PhD student doing fieldwork, of course, I wasn't in such a precarious position, but I also reflected on that sort of insider-outsider status in terms of precarity that I have now as an academic in a public university in the global scope. That I am in a more precarious professional position than colleagues, for example, at prestigious universities in the North. And so I am assessed on the outputs. I am assessed on publications and all of these sorts of metrics, right? The quantitative metrics that we've talked about previously. And so to a degree, having been educated in the North as well, I've also been an insider-outsider, and so that insider-outsider status shifts, of course, as it does for everyone, in these different spaces and in these different fields. And I think one of the things that I've appreciated most is that that awareness of, if we want to call it precarity, or that kind of structural privilege as well, that we experience and embody in different spaces and places at different times and different stages in our life, like many other human beings.
Yes, and like you say, not just in the field, but in our careers as a whole. I'd love to hear from you as well. Would you like to echo in? Yeah.
Tuomas.
Collaborators understand what you do. How do they make sense of what you understand?
I just say very shortly, I have had very privileged to work in very different settings with Moroccan urban poor with very little education and with very educated Iraqis, and obviously they understand it very differently, of course. And I think that it's quite natural for me to put myself into this kind of apprentice position. It's very helpful for me to let the other know that I'm here to learn from you, and then let the sort of relation evolve from that. It became, I kind of learned this method of approach in Morocco, and sorry. Well, they understand that I'm here to learn about their life. I was in a quite privileged position when I started my fieldwork, because I was quite fluent in Arabic when I started my PhD. So I had 7 years of Arabic studies before, and I didn't have the problem of communicating to my people with whom I spent my time, what I was doing. And of course, it's, you know, many months of you know, tensions and attempts to manipulate and disappointments, but little by little, I think I created quite consistent role of I'm here to learn from your life, and then my method became that hang around with nice people, and I have been very consistent with that. This is my partiality. I don't even try to create closeness with people with whom it doesn't go naturally. There's this gut feeling that I follow always. And especially when working with, you know, conflict areas or, you know, communities like Iraqi diaspora in Europe, there's so many tensions, and you very quickly, you kind of use the sixth sense that, oh, I don't want to go there. I need to stay safe distance from there. And you have to acknowledge this partiality. And for me, I don't think I ever wrote it out on a paper that my method is to hang around with nice people, but I have always said it to students that you don't worry, you will be partial anyway, so hang around with the people with whom it is easy, because otherwise you will not, you know, you will not learn about their lives if there are tensions and you all the time have to struggle. How is the dynamic relation between us? So.
Very well formulated, but just I answer quickly. For me, it varies really a lot, because in the other end, there's Christian rappers who have PhDs who understand very well what this is about. But then there's also others who perhaps don't have that clear picture about it and don't see that what is this of value for me. And that's also the persons that it's really hard to get access to, because, and then I've quite, at least in this current field and also in South Africa, at times I've used a double role, that I'm a journalist. I can write some feature article about you, and then in order to get this access, and that's something that has sometimes.
Matti and Henry, yeah.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this. The one thing that keeps on kind of cropping up and bubbling under, and maybe bubbling over in Tuomas's case, because you've kind of made this already, this point a couple of times. This roundtable kind of kicked off with the issue of cultivating empathy. And then we've covered collaborative projects, commitments, friendships, and so forth. What is empathy in ethnographic fieldwork? Is it a pre-requirement, like Marko says, at least in Marko's case? Is it a method? Is it an effect of the ethnographic encounter? Or is it some nice bit of extra? I'm asking this because over the past couple of years, I've noticed that whereas we as anthropologists are very good at understanding, let's say, non-European people's non-scientific worldviews, we are very good at attacking our own, let's say, anti-vaxxers. or certain libertarian groups and so forth. Now, Tuomas here is asking, is it a problem that we start seeing their point of view a bit too well, that we become a mouthpiece for them? A colleague of ours at the University of Manchester who studies libertarian groups in the UK, and I think does a brilliant job at that, has kind of recently received the question, shouldn't you somehow detach yourself from these people? Shouldn't you disavow them because these are some horrible people? So back to the question, what is empathy? And if empathy is a pre-requirement or a method, then does it limit our possibility to open up to the unexpected?
Excellent. Who wants to start?
I always start. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I don't have an answer, but it resonated to me that we have, I also have been part of one project that was doing ethnography among populist or whatever populist is defined parties, but very kind of racist parties in different European settings and also in Finland. And I remember some of the discussions and fieldwork experiences related to that, and exactly that, what kind of relation between the ethnographer and these people who had, of course, very, very bad ideas about different communities and so on. But yeah, like I myself, I never thought like I don't think empathy. Obviously, there is more like the role of anthropology. Of course, maybe it's an idea to create understandings about different life words and so on, and maybe in a way, maybe in that direction it could go also to empathy. But I don't know, empathy to me also as a word, is it it reflects the power dynamics, or like it is an oppressive relation, like who has empathy towards whom or something like that. So I wouldn't call like empathy, because I think empathy, but then there is compassion, affections in the so I don't know, but I think empathy is, though of course it's sometimes of course also those people feel kind of empathy, but I think empathy for me is that feeling empathy, it's not something that it kind of underlines unsymmetric relationship. So I wouldn't say that for me it's like a method that I go to the field and I feel that I have empathy towards those to what I encounter in there. So that was like more like of a method, but I think more from, like I said, from this public, like the effects, or if we want to contribute to something in the society, whatever, raising empathy, though that's also like, do you raise empathy? Because exactly, you know, with some particular issues that though you give access to knowledge and present different narratives, the effect is also not always raising empathy or making justice. So that it's kind of difficult promise also. But of course, if it has this kind of productive effects, it's a good thing. But there is something about, maybe the right word is not empathy, empathy, but something else that kind of could describe the relation. Yeah, report, interaction, but that's so sterile in a way, kind of, or yeah, everything is kind of interaction, but yeah.
If that was a really good question, I have to think about it more, but if I think it really practically, it's also this double role that I have different set of ethics than, for example, journalists. There's a good reason why some musicians don't give access to every journalist. I at least try that I don't put the individual musician in a bad light. I try to avoid that. I can be critical of the structure or ideological, but I somehow try to, of course, it's always a somehow specific encounter, but there I try to protect the individual musician, unlike journalists can somehow dig some dirt from that individual musician.
For me, it's quite a straightforward question, but I'm not so sure if it's a methodological question or what it is. For me, it starts like this: you have an interest towards certain, issues in the social life of people, and if you have interest and you write the proposal for research, so you're ready to listen. So for me, it starts from the readiness to listen and to be ready to, encounter surprises. It's always very surprising. Then the problems start to emerge when, I have been lately interviewing Yazidi genocide survivors, and when they talk to me, thank God it's in Zoom. I'm not doing normal field work because it would maybe be too much. But I feel that they feel that their experience, they're so extreme that even like sharing these stories would like pollute the relations. Like, I don't want to spoil your week. That's when it gets really difficult. I don't have response to that. I'm still very interested and ready to hear, but I'm afraid that it's too much. And I notice that they are uncomfortable because they hint what they have experienced, but they cannot go in there, and I cannot push them to go there. And I'm not even sure if I can go there. So it's unresolved question. Readiness of listening also has its limit, because you don't want to go too deep in people's pain.
Yeah, I like your formulation of thinking of empathy as sort of an act or orientation of active listening or openness or willingness to learn. And would you like to?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think for me also it's quite straightforward, because cultivating empathy and sympathy is a particularly important attribute of doing ethnography for me, precisely because one, it recognizes that there are these, as colleagues have said, these asymmetries that we find everywhere, but it doesn't necessarily presume. For example, in my case, thinking about asymmetries of modernity and how these are differently experienced over centuries, and how people grapple with these, but it doesn't. It's a capability and attitude that can be developed, because, and I think it's important to do so because it helps, certainly in my case, the younger students and more mature students, and also the public at large, to recognize the value of doing ethnography and the value of anthropology as a discipline. So the way that I sometimes talk about it is doing anthropology as public citizenship, questioning norms and who benefits, the basic question. Who benefits the current with structures and institutions that we have in place, and the kind of naturalization of that. And so I guess, again, it's this sort of the thinking about ideology. But the second thing is that I don't want to have, and nor do I think people should have, empathy or be sympathetic to everyone, because I am not, and this I think also links with the view that I have of anthropology as very political. It is not an apolitical discipline. And so linking with activism, I think as colleagues have mentioned, I don't want to have empathy with a rapist. But I want to be able to understand. I don't want to have empathy, as you said, with anti-vaxxers. But there has to be a way in which we can appreciate or understand, and also then engage in what I see as the political project of anthropology, to point out the different components that, for example, in the case of an anti-vaxxer, may not have recognized. And so I think, again, that brings us up against a dangerous problem of the power imbalances and the asymmetries. Because, for example, if we're studying up, right, to use a terrible term, but one I still think is relevant. I'm not empathetic with elites, with the 1%, for example. And I mean, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, let's say, I'm not empathetic, but I can understand all of the kinds of structures and institutions, as well as everyday experiences and affects that go into creating this position, and the beliefs and the attitudes that people have. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are almost run out of time. Jukka, do you think we should wrap up now, or?
Unless someone has an urgent question or comment.
I think it's been a long day, and we can continue these conversations over dinner and maybe tomorrow as well. So thank you so much for the roundtable discussions. It was lovely hearing from you, and thank you for your questions. And I'll see you shortly for dinner.